Between 1914 and 1929, one village doctor in rural Hungary signed more than 50 death certificates. Every single one listed stomach illness. He never performed a single autopsy. Not one. The widows always paid him promptly, usually in eggs. Meanwhile, the village midwife was selling something from her kitchen that was not medicine. Were these women survivors, or did they become the monsters they were trying to escape? Before we continue, I have to show you a comment from a previous video. Look at what they said. Australia. What touched me is the love between these two and the desire to keep their family together, as imperfect as it was. This is exactly why I do this, because you get it. These aren't just old tales. They are voices that deserve to be remembered. But here is the reality. Research takes time. If you believe these stories matter as much, please make sure you like, subscribe, and if you can, check the description for the Buy Me a Coffee link. Your support, no matter how small, keeps these forgotten voices alive. Thank you to those who have supported the channel recently. You are making sure that these stories survive. Now, back to the story. Numbers do not lie. But in the Hungarian village of Nagyrév, nobody was counting. Tucked along a bend of the Tisza River, about 100 kilometers southeast of Budapest, Nagyrév was the kind of place the 20th century forgot to visit. Roughly 1,500 people lived there. Farmers, mostly. They grew wheat, raised livestock, and kept to themselves. The nearest city was far enough away that most villagers never saw it. There was no police station, no courthouse, no coroner. There was one doctor, and that doctor had a very relaxed relationship with paperwork. Between 1914 and 1929, Nagyrév recorded a staggering number of deaths among adult men. Heart failure, tuberculosis, stomach ailments, exposure. Every cause sounded reasonable enough on its own, but taken together, the pattern was impossible to ignore. It would have been impossible to ignore if anyone had bothered to look. Here is what the numbers actually showed. The death rate among men in Nagyrév was nearly 3 times the national average for villages of comparable size. In a community this small, that is not a statistical blip. That is an emergency. But rural Hungary in the early 1900s did not have a system for flagging emergencies. Death certificates were filed locally, stored in parish records, and never cross-referenced with anything. The regional health authority, such as it was, had neither the staff nor the interest to audit mortality data from a peasant village on the floodplains. And then there was the doctor. To put this in perspective, modern forensic standards require an autopsy whenever the cause of death is unclear. In Nagyrév, the village doctor performed no autopsies over the entire 15-year period. Not one. He examined bodies the way you might glance at a parking meter, briefly, and only because you technically had to. He was often paid in eggs, grain, or wine, and his medical training was to be generous, rudimentary. So when a 40-year-old farmer dropped dead after a week of vomiting, the doctor wrote gastric disturbance on the death certificate and moved on with his mourning. When another man died 2 months later with identical symptoms, he wrote the same thing. And when the pattern repeated itself, year after year, across dozens of households, he simply kept writing. Nobody questioned it. Not the church, not the county office. Not a single official in the entire region raised a hand and asked why this village was burying men at 3 times the expected rate. Because in rural Hungary, peasant men just died sometimes, naturally. In 1914, the Austro-Hungarian Empire dragged its men to war, and the women of Nagyrév discovered something dangerous. They discovered they could survive without them. Now, to understand what happened next, You need to understand what life looked like for a Hungarian peasant woman before the war. It was not great. Marriage was essentially an economic contract. A woman moved from her father's household to her husband's. She worked his land, bore his children, cooked his meals, and had roughly the same legal standing as his livestock. Divorce was technically possible under Hungarian law, but for a rural woman with no money, no education, and no independent legal status, it existed the way a fire escape exists on the 90th floor, theoretically available, practically useless. Then the men left for the trenches of the Eastern Front, and everything changed. For the first time in their lives, the women of Nagyrév ran the farms themselves. They managed the money. They made decisions about planting and harvest without consulting anyone. They sold grain at market. They negotiated with buyers. And believe it or not, the village did not collapse. It functioned. In some respects, it functioned better than it had before. But the war brought something else to the region that nobody talks about. A prisoner of war camp was established near the village, housing soldiers from occupied territories. These were young men, far from home, with no oversight and nowhere to go. And the women of Nagyrév, also with no oversight and very little to lose, formed relationships with some of them. Let me be clear about what this meant in context. These were not scandalous city affairs. And these were isolated women in a forgotten village, cut off from their husbands for years at a time, with no communication and no certainty those husbands were even alive. Some of these relationships produced children. The village knew. The church knew. Everyone looked the other way, because what exactly were they going to do about it? For roughly 4 years, Nagyrév operated as something resembling a self-governing community of women. Not by philosophy, not by ideology, but simply by the mathematics of who was still alive and present. Then 1918 arrived. The war ended, and the husbands came home. They came home after farms that had been reorganized without their input, to wives who had learned to function independently, to household routines that no longer revolved around them, and in some cases, to children who bore no resemblance to anyone in their family. You might be wondering how the men reacted to all of this. If you are imagining calm conversation and mutual understanding, you have not spent much time studying early 20th century rural patriarchies. What came next was not a homecoming. It was a collision. And the women of Nagyrév were about to learn that the freedom they had tasted was not something they would be allowed to keep, at least not through any legitimate means. The men who returned from the Eastern Front were not the same men who had left. And honestly, it would have been a miracle if they were. 4 years in the trenches of World War I did something to the human mind that medicine in 1918 had no vocabulary for. Today, we would call it post-traumatic stress disorder. Back then, they called it shell shock, if they called it anything at all. Most of the time, they called it nothing. A man came home quieter, angrier, prone to sudden rages and long silences, and the village simply said that is how men are after war. But here is what made Nagyrév different from other villages dealing with the same problem. The women here had tasted something most Hungarian peasant women never experienced. 4 years of autonomy. 4 years of managing their own finances, running their own households, and answering to nobody. And now they were expected to hand all of that back to men who, in many cases, returned more volatile and controlling than they had been before they left. The clashes were immediate and brutal, and returning soldiers found wives who did not flinch the way they used to. Some found evidence of the wartime relationships that the whole village had quietly tolerated. A few came home to children they knew were not theirs. The confrontations that followed were predictable and grim. Now, if you are thinking these women could have simply left, let me walk you through their options. Hungarian family law in this period was not designed with women's independence in mind. A wife could not initiate divorce without proving extreme circumstances, and even then, the process required legal representation that a peasant woman could not afford, and courts that a peasant woman could not physically reach. There was no domestic violence statute. A husband's behavior inside his own home was considered a private family matter. The local authorities, meaning the village magistrate, who was usually a drinking companion of the husband in question, and had neither the power nor the inclination to intervene. So to recap, no divorce, no legal protection, no shelter system, no family court, no police response, no financial independence, because the moment the husband returned, property control reverted to him by law. The women of Nagyrév had exactly the same number of institutional options as they'd had before the war. 0. And yet something had fundamentally shifted. These were no longer women who accepted that reality as permanent. And they had lived differently. They knew a different version of their own lives was possible. The question was no longer whether they wanted out. The question was how. Somewhere in this window, between 1918 and roughly 1920, the women of Nagyrév began visiting the village midwife in numbers that had nothing to do with pregnancy. Her name was Julia Fazekas, and she had an answer to a question that the Hungarian legal system refused to address. But that answer would change everything. Julia Fazekas was not a doctor. She was not a pharmacist. She was not, by any formal definition, a medical professional at all. But in a village with one incompetent physician and no hospital for miles, she was the closest thing to a healthcare system that the women of Nagyrév had. Fazekas served as the village midwife, which in early 20th century rural Hungary meant far more than delivering babies. She was the herbalist, the healer, the woman you visited when you had a fever, a toothache, or a problem you could not take to the doctor because the doctor was a man, and the problem involved things men were not supposed to hear about. She handled pregnancies, yes, but also infections, rashes, digestive troubles, and the quiet, unspoken consultations that happened behind closed doors. She was, by all accounts, a practical woman. Hard, unsentimental, widowed herself, under circumstances that nobody at the time thought to examine closely. She understood the village and its power structures the way only someone who operated outside those structures could. The men ran the farms and the church and the local government. Fazekas ran the thing underneath all of that. The network of whispered conversations between women who had no other place to turn. At some point, and historians still debate exactly when, Fazekas made a discovery. Flypaper, the sticky sheets used to trap insects in kitchens and barns across Hungary, contained arsenic. Boil enough of it in water for long enough, and you could extract a concentrated liquid, colorless, tasteless, nearly odorless, and in the right dosage, absolutely lethal. To put this in perspective, arsenic in small doses produces symptoms that are virtually identical to common gastrointestinal illness: nausea, vomiting, stomach cramps, weakness. Yes, in a village with contaminated well water and poor sanitation, these symptoms would raise exactly zero suspicion. A man could be given small doses over several days, appear to be suffering from a stomach bug, and be dead within a week. The village doctor, who we have already established was not exactly Sherlock Holmes with a stethoscope, would sign the death certificate without a second glance. Fazekas began offering this solution to women who came to her with complaints about their husbands. It was arranged, usually in goods rather than cash was arranged, usually in goods rather than money. And that was that. The first successful case proved the concept entirely. A husband fell ill, suffered for a few days, died. The doctor wrote gastric illness on the certificate. The widow grieved publicly, inherited the farm, and got on with her life. Nobody asked questions. Nobody investigated. Nobody even found it unusual. Word spread through the village the way all information travels in small communities. Quietly, selectively, woman to woman. And Julia Fazekas had just become the most powerful person in Nagyrév. The first poisoning in Nagyrév may have been an act of desperation. The second may have been survival. But by the fifth or sixth, something had shifted that could never shift back. Fazekas did not operate alone for long. Her cousin, Suzy Ola, became a key partner in what was quickly becoming an organized operation. Ola helped prepare the arsenic solution and assisted with distribution. Together, yet the two women created a quiet supply chain that operated entirely within the domestic spaces of the village. Kitchens, root cellars, back gardens. The infrastructure of murder looked exactly like the infrastructure of daily life, which is precisely why it was invisible. In the early phase, the women who sought out Fazekas were those in genuinely desperate circumstances. Wives enduring violence. Women trapped with husbands who drank away the family's income. Cases where, by any modern standard, that intervention was desperately needed and none existed. But desperation has a way of redefining itself. Within a few years, the reasons women visited the midwife began to evolve. A husband did not need to be violent to become inconvenient. He simply needed to be in the way. Maybe he refused to sell a parcel of land. Maybe he was old, and his care was becoming burdensome. Maybe a woman had fallen in love with someone else and saw no other path forward. The justification expanded, but quietly and steadily, until the original moral framework had stretched beyond recognition. And then it expanded further. Elderly parents whose care required time and resources began to die of stomach ailments. Relatives whose inheritance was desired fell ill with suspicious timing. The circle of victims grew to include people who were not husbands at all. Some accounts suggest that even individuals who simply knew too much, and who had perhaps noticed a pattern or heard a whispered conversation they should not have, became targets. Get this, over roughly 15 years, an estimated 50 or more people were poisoned in and around Nagyrév. Some researchers place the number significantly higher, potentially exceeding 100 across the surrounding villages where Fazekas' network reached. The women involved eventually became known by a name that captured both the horror and the grotesque irony of what they had done: the angel makers of Nagyrév. Angels, because they sent people to heaven. That was the logic. That was the local euphemism for what was, by any objective measure, one of the largest serial poisoning operations in modern European history. And here is perhaps the most chilling detail of all. It was not secrecy that protected them. Not really. It was the simple fact that nobody with any authority considered the deaths of Hungarian peasant men worth investigating. But the angel makers did not hide in the shadows. They hid in plain sight, behind a system that refused to look. You would think that 50 deaths, possibly more, spread across a decade and a half in a village of 1,500 people would be difficult to miss. You would be wrong, because missing it was not a failure of the system. It was exactly how the system was designed to work. Let us walk through the layers of oversight that should have caught this. And then let us watch each one do absolutely nothing. Start with the village doctor. We have already established that this human performed 0 autopsies in 15 years. But it is worth understanding why. Rural physicians in early 20th century Hungary were not forensic specialists. Many had minimal training. They served enormous areas, visited patients infrequently, and were compensated so poorly that they depended on the goodwill of the very families they were supposed to be objectively evaluating. When a farmer's wife told the doctor her husband had been vomiting for 3 days and then passed in his sleep, the doctor had every financial and social incentive to nod, sign the certificate, and accept the basket of eggs on his way out the door. Now, move up to the county level. Hungary in this period had a regional public health infrastructure that existed largely on paper. Death certificates were filed with parish churches and local clerks. There was no centralized database, no cross-referencing, no statistical analysis. If you wanted to identify an unusual mortality pattern in Nagyrév, you would have needed to physically travel to the village, collect every death record by hand, and compile the data yourself. Nobody had the budget, the mandate, yet or frankly, the interest to do this for a peasant settlement along the Tisa River. Then, there is the question of motive. Or rather, the question of who benefits from asking questions. The answer, in this case, was nobody. The widows inherited the farms, which kept the local economy stable. The church collected funeral fees. The doctor kept his patients and his income. The county office received no complaints because the families of the deceased were, in many cases, the ones responsible for the deaths. There was no grieving relative banging on the magistrate's door, demanding justice. The entire feedback loop that normally triggers an investigation simply did not exist. And finally, the poison itself. Arsenic, in the doses Fazekas recommended, produced symptoms that were clinically indistinguishable from a dozen common illnesses. Cholera, dysentery, contaminated food or water. In a region where sanitation was poor and gastrointestinal disease was a leading cause of death anyway, the symptoms were so ordinary, they were practically camouflage. To be fair, even a competent and well-funded authority might have struggled to detect arsenic poisoning without toxicology testing, which was not standard practice in rural Hungary at this time. The technology existed. It simply was not deployed for people the state considered expendable. So when people ask how this went undetected for 15 years, the answer is not that the angel makers were criminal geniuses. The answer is that nobody was looking. Not because they could not see, because seeing would have required caring. And caring about peasant villages was not on anyone's agenda. For 15 years, the secret held. And then, in 1929, a single piece of paper brought the entire village to its knees. An anonymous letter arrived at the desk of a local newspaper editor in the town of Zolnok. The contents were brief and specific. Someone alleged that residents of Nagyrév and surrounding villages were being systematically poisoned, that the deaths everyone had accepted as natural were anything but, and that, if the authorities bothered to actually test the bodies buried in the village cemetery, they would find proof. Now, anonymous tips are not exactly rare in journalism. Most lead nowhere, but this one contained enough precise detail that the editor passed it along to the county prosecutor's office. And for the first time in over a decade, someone in an official capacity turned their attention toward the quiet little village along the Tisa River. The investigation began cautiously. Authorities obtained permission to exhume several bodies from the Nagyrév cemetery. The first coffin was opened. Tissue samples were sent to a laboratory in Budapest for toxicological analysis. The results came back positive for lethal concentrations of arsenic. They exhumed a second body. Positive. A third. Positive. A fourth. A fifth. A sixth. Every single corpse they tested showed arsenic levels far beyond what could be explained by natural exposure or environmental contamination. The cemetery was not a resting place. It was an evidence locker that nobody had thought to open. The exhumation spread. Investigators moved from grave to grave, and what they uncovered was not a handful of isolated incidents. It was a pattern so widespread that the forensic team reportedly struggled to keep pace with the volume of contaminated remains. Each positive result pointed backward toward the same network, the same method, the same source. Arrests began quickly. Women were brought in for questioning. Some denied everything. Others, faced with the forensic evidence pulled from their own family plots, began to talk. And once one woman talked, and the silence that had held for 15 years collapsed like a dam. Names were given. Dates were recalled. The web of complicity turned out to be far larger than investigators had initially imagined. This was not 2 or 3 women acting independently. This was a coordinated operation with a supply chain, a distribution network, and a shared understanding that silence was survival. At the center of every confession sat the same name, Julia Fazekas. But when word reached the midwife that authorities were coming, she made a final calculation. Fazekas retrieved her own supply of the poison she had spent years distributing to others. By the time police arrived at her door, she had taken a fatal dose. The architect of the angel makers died by the same method she had taught to dozens of women across the region. She left behind no confession, no written record, no explanation. Only a village full of graves that were finally being forced to tell the truth. 26 women were arrested. The largest mass poisoning prosecution in Hungarian history was about to begin. And somehow, the most important questions would never be asked. The trials took place between 1929 and 1930, and they consumed the Hungarian press like wildfire. Reporters descended on the region from Budapest and beyond. A headline screamed about the monstrous women of the Tisza River. Editorial pages competed to find the most dramatic language. Demons, witches, unnatural creatures. The coverage treated the accused as aberrations of nature rather than products of a specific and documentable set of circumstances. In the courtroom, the proceedings revealed the full scope of what had happened. Confessions detailed years of coordinated activity. Women described visiting Fazekas, receiving the poison, administering it over the course of days, and then presenting themselves at the doctor's office as grieving widows. Some spoke matter-of-factly, others wept. A few expressed remorse that seemed genuine. Others showed none at all. The testimony painted a picture of a community where poisoning had become so normalized that women discussed it the way they might discuss a remedy for a sick cow. It had lost its moral weight through sheer repetition, but the first act may have felt like crossing an unthinkable line. By the 10th or 20th, it was simply how problems were solved in Nagyrév. Sentences were handed down with the severity the public demanded. 8 women received death sentences. Others were given life imprisonment or lengthy prison terms. Several of the death sentences were later commuted on appeal, but the message was clear. The state had found its villains, punished them visibly, and closed the book. But here is what the trial never addressed. Not once during the proceedings did any prosecutor, judge, or legal authority seriously examine the conditions that made the angel makers possible. Nobody asked why Hungarian family law offered women no exit from violent marriages. Nobody questioned why a single unqualified doctor was the only medical oversight for an entire region. Nobody investigated why the county had no system for tracking unusual death patterns. Nobody held the institutional apparatus accountable for 15 years of willful blindness. The women were guilty. That is not in dispute. What they did was monstrous by any standard. But guilt does not exist in a vacuum. It exists within systems that either prevent harm or enable it. And the system surrounding Nagyrév did not simply fail to prevent harm. It created the precise conditions under which harm became, for these women, a rational solution to an impossible problem. To be clear, it was crossed and then erased entirely, but was crossed and then erased entirely. But the trial asked only one question. What did these women do? It never asked the harder one. What made them believe this was their only option? After the trials ended and the journalists left, Nagyrév still existed. The farms still needed tending, and the river still flooded in spring. And the people who remained had to figure out how to live in a community where everyone knew what had happened, and nobody knew exactly who else had been involved. That is perhaps the most overlooked chapter of this story, the aftermath. Because here is the uncomfortable mathematics. 26 women were charged, but the poisoning network, by most credible estimates, involved significantly more participants than that. Women who purchased arsenic, but were never identified. Women who knew what was happening and said nothing. Neighbors who noticed patterns and chose silence. The 26 who stood trial were the ones the evidence could reach. They were not necessarily the only ones responsible, which raises a question that historians have debated for nearly a century. Who sent the anonymous letter? The identity of the tipster was never conclusively established. Some researchers believe it was a woman on the periphery of the network who developed a conscience. Others suggest it was someone who had been threatened, perhaps a person who knew too much and feared becoming the next target. A third theory points to a family member of one of the later victims, someone who had suspicions but lacked proof until they found a way to direct the authorities toward the cemetery. Whoever it was, they understood something critical, and they knew that simply telling the local authorities would accomplish nothing, because the local authorities were part of the infrastructure that had enabled the killings in the first place. So they bypassed the village entirely and went to the press. It was, in its own way, a remarkably sophisticated act of whistleblowing for a rural peasant community in 1929. After the convictions, Nagyrév became a kind of cautionary landmark. The Hungarian government used the case to justify reforms in rural medical oversight and death certification procedures. Autopsy requirements were tightened. Regional health inspectors were given broader authority. The reforms were real, but they arrived roughly 15 years and dozens of bodies too late. The village itself carried the stigma for generations. Families changed their names. Young people left for the cities and never mentioned where they came from. Nagyrév became synonymous with a single story, and that story overshadowed everything else about the community, its history, its culture, its ordinary people who had nothing to do with the poisonings. And in the wider world, the angel makers became a kind of dark folklore, a story retold in true crime books and documentaries, usually with emphasis on the horror and very little attention paid to the structural conditions that produced it. But there is one more layer to this case that rarely gets discussed, a question that sits underneath everything else and refuses to offer a comfortable answer. That question is what makes this final chapter necessary. If you strip away the horror, the headlines, and the sensationalism, the story of Nagyrév asks one question that no court, no historian, and no documentary has ever fully resolved. What happens when a society traps people with no exit, and then acts surprised when they find one? This is not a defense of what the angel makers did. Let that be absolutely clear. What began as arguably desperate acts by women in impossible situations metastasized into something far beyond self-preservation. People who posed no threat were killed. Elderly relatives whose only offense was requiring care. Neighbors who became inconvenient. The moral boundary that might have existed at the beginning was obliterated long before the anonymous letter reached the newspaper editor's desk. But here is what makes this case more than just a true crime curiosity. Every single institutional safeguard that should have prevented this case existed somewhere in Hungary at the time. Forensic toxicology was an established science by the early 1900s. Autopsy procedures were well understood. Death certification standards existed in Hungarian cities. Criminal investigation methods were perfectly capable of detecting arsenic. None of these tools were considered necessary for a peasant village. The technology to catch the angel makers was available from the very first poisoning. It simply was not deployed for people the state deemed unimportant. And the legal framework that trapped these women in violent households was not an oversight. It was policy. Hungarian family law deliberately restricted women's ability to leave marriages, own property independently, or seek legal protection from domestic harm. But these were not gaps in the system. They were the system, functioning exactly as intended. So when we remember the angel makers, what exactly are we remembering? 26 women who committed terrible acts? Certainly. A midwife who weaponized chemistry for profit and power? Without question. But we should also remember the doctor who never performed an autopsy, the county office that never tracked a death pattern, the legal code that offered women no legitimate escape. Support the entire apparatus of indifference that looked at a village burying its men at 3 times the normal rate and shrugged. The angel makers of Nagyrév are remembered as murderers. History recorded their names, their sentences, their crimes. The institutions that made them possible are remembered as nothing. Because institutions do not stand trial. They do not receive sentences. They simply continue, reformed or unreformed, into the next generation. It's where they wait to produce the next set of impossible choices for the next group of people nobody considers worth protecting. Nagyrév still exists today, a quiet village along the Tisa River. The cemetery is still there. Most of the graves have settled into the earth by now, their secrets long since excavated and cataloged. But the question remains, buried deeper than any coffin. When a society offers no way out, who is truly responsible for what happens next? If this story made you think about the systems we still take for granted today, make sure you like the video. It tells us you want more stories that dig beneath the surface. And if this is your first time here, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because every week we uncover the histories that textbooks were too comfortable to teach. The past is not done with us. Not even close.